There's an old map that I uncovered during the course of my research, which really drives home Pittsburgh's centrality to the empire of U.S. Steel. I've included it in the story map that accompanies this podcast, so please feel free to check it out when you get the chance. But for all of you listening right now, I'll do my best to describe it. It's a map of the United States, and the date on it is 1902. It's yellowed with age, and there are visible pencil marks and creases along the edges. The title in the bottom right corner reads, Distribution of Iron Ores Mined in the Lake Superior Region. The map is full of red lines, some solid, some dotted, which trace the flow of iron ore, primarily from Minnesota and Wisconsin to other destinations in the United States. Red lines pour out of the Vermilion and Mesabi iron ranges and across the Great Lakes, adding streams here and there until they eventually converge like an artery feeding into a beating heart. That heart is Pittsburgh. You're listening to Extraction, the story of U.S. Steel's insatiable demand for human and natural resources and the people and places that supplied them. I'm your host, Chie Togami, and this is Part 2, Steel.
I mean, today when you come in from the airport site, you come through the Fort Pitt, the view is phenomenal. It's one of the classic views of any city in the nation. It blows everybody away the first time. Imagine in the 60s when you did that. It was fire all the way up the valley. Just saw fire and smoke and the mills. It was incredible. It's a massive, it's hard impossible to describe them. They're so big. They're 10, 12 miles long. These massive steel mills. It's like going to Gary. I remember going to Gary and delivering steel to one of the Gary mills. They go on forever. And they just blow you away, the size of the structures that are around you.
Mel Packer, whose voice you just heard, wasn't born in Pittsburgh, but he's lived in the city for over 5 decades, long enough to bear witness to massive transformation. And what he's describing is what Pittsburgh looked like over 50 years ago, in 1965, when he drove through the Fort Pitt Tunnel and first laid eyes on the incredible panoramic view of Pittsburgh that has mesmerized people for generations. I arrived in Pittsburgh 50 years after Mel in 2015, and I too remember the first time I saw that view of the city. For those of you who haven't had the quintessentially Pittsburgh experience of passing through the Fort Pitt Tunnel, I have to say, it really is sort of magical. The tunnel, which takes you through Mount Washington, is like entering a dark portal, and when you emerge, you're suddenly in the light on a bridge overlooking the confluence of 2 rivers, with the city rising in the triangle of land in between, and bridges in each direction as far as the eye can see. But of course, what Mel draws attention to in his reflection is not just the stunning geography, but the fire and smoke, markers of the all-encompassing presence of the industry this region is known for, steel. In this episode, we'll discuss some of the history concerning the rise and decline of the steel industry in and around Pittsburgh. We'll talk about the pivotal role of unions in the fight for more fair and humane working conditions, and also consider how the story of steel has and continues to be shaped by larger global forces. If you're just joining, I encourage you to go back and listen to the previous episode, Part 1, which focuses on the stories of the people and places that supplied critical raw materials for steel production. Thanks for listening. For over a century, the presence of industry has overwritten the history of Pittsburgh and the surrounding area. Today, however, I want to start at an earlier point in time and give an abridged but important overview of some local history that predates this region's transformation into an industrial hub. Long before Pittsburgh was known as the Steel City, before the air was hazy with soot and fires lit the darkened sky up and down the valleys, it was first the verdant home of indigenous peoples. Today, if you look around this area, you will find many places and rivers with names derived from Native American languages, such as Allegheny, Monongahela, Aliquippa, and Youghiogheny. And these names gesture to the area's rich indigenous history. In fact, archaeologists have found evidence of early peoples inhabiting this region as early as 16,000 BC, based on analysis of the Meadowcraft rock shelter, a site located some 27 miles southwest of the city of Pittsburgh. Between 1000 to 200 BC, Western Pennsylvania was home to Native American societies collectively referred to as the Adena culture, also known as the Mound Builders, for the complex burial and ceremonial earthworks that they left behind. There is little consensus about what ultimately led to the disappearance of the Mound Builders, and scholars have presented competing theories involving disease, crop failure, and conflict. Whatever the cause, however, the Adena culture had vanished by the time Europeans first arrived in the area in the early 1600s. Instead, they encountered a different group of native peoples, the Monongahela. The Monongahela people were known for living in small, settled communities that practiced maize agriculture. Unlike other contemporaneous tribes that are represented in the ethno-historic record, the vast majority of what is known about the Monongahela people comes from archaeological digs, which have provided evidence that the Monongahela participated in the trade of whelk shells, using a trade route that stretched between Chesapeake Bay, the Ohio-Allegheny Valley, and the Ontario and Lower Great Lakes region. By the mid-1650s, the Monongahela too appear to have left the Ohio Valley region for unknown reasons, perhaps having been driven out by pressure from other tribes. By the early 1700s, the region was controlled by the Iroquois Confederacy, comprised of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations, who were using the upper Ohio River Valley as hunting grounds. The region was also occupied by Lenape, Shawnee, Wendat, and Mohican people, who had moved into the area after being forced westward by white settlers, who continued to arrive in droves, displacing native peoples from their ancestral land. The mid-1700s saw numerous skirmishes in the Ohio Valley between the British and allied French and Native American forces. For several years, the British mounted a number of unsuccessful attempts to take control of Fort Duquesne, a French fort which had been built in 1754 at the strategically important confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. In 1758, British forces finally prevailed in seizing the fort from the French, who set the place ablaze as a final parting shot before retreating from the Ohio Valley. General John Forbes, who had led the British forces, renamed it Fort Pitt after the British statesman William Pitt the Elder. In the years after the British takeover, the area we know as Pittsburgh developed a reputation as a bustling center for river commerce and boat building. Known as the Gateway to the West, Pittsburgh served as the debarkation point for many westward journeys. In fact, Pittsburgh was the launch point of the famed 3-year-long Lewis and Clark expedition, commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson, which officially began on August 31, 1803, when Captain Meriwether Lewis launched a 50-foot keelboat into the Allegheny River, setting off with a crew to meet William Clark, who was headquartered down the Ohio River near Louisville, Kentucky. Beginning in the period between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, Pittsburgh's economy began to shift away from commerce and towards industry, as other river cities like St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Louisville began siphoning off more and more business. One leading industry that began to take hold around Pittsburgh was iron production, a precursor to the steel industry. This became especially important during the Civil War, when Pittsburgh's industrial base was tapped to manufacture over 3,000 cannons for the Union cause. Towards the end of the 19th century, one of the critical factors that shaped the region's shift away from iron production and towards steelmaking was the growing demand from railroad companies for stronger and more resilient rails and bridges to accommodate longer, larger, and heavier locomotives. As it so happened, this high demand for steel coincided with the diffusion of two new steelmaking technologies, the Bessemer process and the open hearth process, which made it possible to mass-produce steel more efficiently and on a scale never seen before. As discussed in the previous episode, the early years of the American steel industry were dominated by a few outsized characters, including American industrialist turned philanthropist Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie spent his early years working for the Pennsylvania Railroad and saw firsthand the high demand for steel. In 1872, he organized a group of investors who together funded the construction of the Edgar Thomson Steelworks in Braddock, Pennsylvania, a colossal mill that was the first large Bessemer mill in the region. In 1883, Carnegie acquired the newly built Homestead Mill and then the Duquesne Works in 1890. When the United States Steel Corporation was formed in 1901, Carnegie Steel Holdings, valued at $480 million then and around $12 billion in today's money, were rolled into the company, making it the largest private corporation in the world at the time and in control of 60% of American steel production. Across the United States, the creation of the United States Steel Corporation had another result. More than 50% of all steelworkers in the U.S. were brought under one employer, U.S. Steel. In 1902, the company's records show that the corporation employed 168,000 people across all of its properties, and by 1910, that number had risen to over 218,000 employees. By the turn of the century, Pittsburgh's population had increased to around 300,000 people, thanks in large part to the growth of the steel industry, which attracted great numbers of immigrant workers, particularly from southeastern European countries. In 1907, records show that 2/3 of the 7,000 men employed at the Homestead Works were foreign-born. During this time period, steel mills were literal and figurative melting pots, but they were also rife with bigotry and nativism. Reports from the early 20th century describe a two-tier system in which native-born white Americans, English, Irish, and German workers were routinely assigned more favorable positions within the mill, whereas Italians, Hungarians, and workers from other Slavic countries were relegated to the least desirable work assignments and hardly ever promoted to supervisory positions. Black steelworkers, who made up a small percentage of Pittsburgh area steelworkers in the early 1900s, continued to grow in numbers as more black workers migrated from the South in search of employment in mills and foundries. As historian Dennis Dickerson describes in his book, Out of the Crucible, Black Steelworkers in Western Pennsylvania, black workers faced discrimination from their employers as well as their white counterparts. Consigned to the most dangerous and least well-paid positions within the mill, black steelworkers were systematically excluded from union membership during the early 20th century. White or black, native or foreign-born, steelworkers of the early 20th century were subject to deplorable working conditions. Between 1907 and 1908, a journalist by the name of John Fitch spearheaded an investigative report on the lives of steelworkers in the Pittsburgh area. Detailed, evocative, and peppered with quotes from steelworkers of the time, John Fitch's report provides an unflinching glimpse at what it was like to work in the mills of Allegheny County around the turn of the century. Namely, relentless, blisteringly hot, and extremely dangerous. In July of 1907, the same year that Fitch began his study of steelworkers, Allegheny County also became the site of one of the first systematic studies of work-related fatalities in the United States. Between July 1906 and June 1907, 526 workers died in workplace accidents in Allegheny County. 195 deaths, or 37% of those fatalities, were steelworkers. In addition to the danger that steelworkers were exposed to day in and day out, Fitch's interviews reveal workers' collective frustration and anger regarding the company's work schedule, which at the time consisted of 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. He writes, quote, "Many a steelworker has said to me with grim bitterness, 'Home is just a place where I eat and sleep. I live in the mills,' end quote. To make matters even worse, every 2 weeks, workers were required to endure something known as the long shift, which consisted of 2 12-hour shifts back to back. This brutal work schedule and U.S. Steel's refusal to recognize workers' unions were among the many grievances which led to the Great Steel Strike of 1919, a nationwide effort which at its height involved over 350,000 steelworkers.
It's 1919, and in South Chicago, steelworkers walk out of mills and stay out. In Gary, Indiana, struck mills are idle behind picket lines composed of women. Explosion inside steel mill, panic strikers and pickets expecting trouble. Nation has not known such unrest as this since First World War.
From South Chicago to Gary, Indiana to Youngstown, Ohio, steelworkers walked the picket line with a list of 12 demands that included provisions such as the right to collective bargaining, an 8-hour day, 1 day's rest in 7, abolition of the 24-hour shift, and the reinstatement with back pay of workers who had been fired for engaging in union activities. To the horror of steel bosses, the strike resulted in mills across the country grinding to a halt. In and around Pittsburgh, however, worker involvement in the strike was mixed. In some places, like nearby Johnstown, participation was nearly 100%, and striking workers benefited from the full support of the town and local government, to the extent that the Johnstown police even deputized strikers to guard the shut-down mills. However, in other mills, especially in the Monongahela Valley, some workers were reluctant to join the picket line. Older steelworkers in particular, whose long memories included the Battle of Homestead in 1892 and the bloody 1909 lockout at the McKees Rocks Pressed Steel Car Company, were more cynical about the likelihood of victory and reticent to risk what little benefits they had accrued from their seniority in the mill. Conversely, younger workers with less seniority and many immigrant workers felt that striking was their only recourse for improving working conditions. For their part, U.S. Steel sought to discourage workers from taking part in the strike by portraying labor organizers as dangerous, un-American radicals. This turned out to be a relatively effective tactic, as the Great Steel Strike of 1919 happened to overlap with the United States' first Red Scare. Stoked by news of the 1917 Bolshevik takeover in Russia, a sizable portion of the American public bought into the idea that recent immigrants and dissidents were plotting to overthrow the U.S. government and install a communist state. Tapping into this collective anxiety, the U.S. Steel Corporation maneuvered to characterize unions as breeding grounds for extremism and labor organizers as Bolshevik sympathizers. In the end, the strike, which lasted from September 1919 through January 1920, ended with no concessions from U.S. Steel. It was an undeniably crushing defeat for labor. And yet, as many people have argued in the years since, the strike laid the groundwork for important industry-wide changes to come. Case in point, in 1923, U.S. Steel finally agreed to end the practice of 12-hour shifts, and in 1937, the company negotiated and signed its first union contract with the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, the union known today as the United Steelworkers. These developments allowed workers to better flex their collective power, and they wielded it time and again via strikes in 1946, 49, 50, 54, 56, and 59 as they sought better wages, benefits, and working conditions. And through those decades, the steel industry had a profound impact on the growth of the U.S. and the wider world. Today, steel is at the center of nearly every city and every form of modern transportation, from railroads to cars to bridges to boats to airplanes. Steel produced at the Homestead Works is at the core of iconic American landmarks, including the Empire State Building, the Oakland Bay Bridge, Panama Canal Locks, St. Louis Arch, and the former Chicago Sears Tower. U.S. Steel also supplied billions of tons of steel for rail projects in China, South Africa, and South America, tin plate for canneries in Australia, Argentina, Portugal, Japan, and Scandinavia, and tubular steel products for oil development in Mexico, Venezuela, the Caribbean, Indonesia, and parts of the Middle East. Steelworkers were also called upon to outfit the nation's military for war.
Our nation's steel companies help America handle not only the defense needs of the moment, but those of the future. This voluntary production means that our fighting men have the best equipment that mill, engineer, and technician can make.
During World War I, Pittsburgh-made steel was used to build battleships and tanks, and U.S. Steel was a major supplier of barbed wire, a product which became integral to trench-style warfare. During World War II, Pittsburgh and a handful of other industrial cities were referred to by U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the arsenal of democracy. Pittsburgh steelworkers continued to churn out steel to be made into guns, munitions, tanks, and trucks, as well as battleships and fighter planes. At the conclusion of World War II, the U.S. steel industry was booming and in a powerful position relative to international competition. Extensive damage caused by the war meant cities across Europe and Asia needed to rebuild, and led to a high global demand for steel. This, and the fact that other major steel-producing nations had had their industrial bases obliterated during the war, created even more demand for American-produced steel, and allowed the U.S. steel industry to function in a manner akin to a cartel, setting and raising prices at their discretion. However, this success came at a price, which would be paid several decades later. Here's Mel again.
The end of World War II, the U.S., in a very privileged position, was the engine of the world. We didn't get bombed. Our factories were intact. We were cranking out ships. We had the productive capacity. What made us think the other nations would not want to do the same thing? Especially as we helped build up the industrial capacity of those nations. Now, the government, of course, was saying, oh, we're just helping them out. Corporations were saying, shit, man, I can go over there and make it cheaper than I can make it here. They always knew what they were doing. And this was newer industry. We weren't building steel mills in Italy or Germany or Japan. According to the 1892 model, we were building brand new mills. While here in the U.S., we were still operating the same goddamn mills they built in 1892. There was obviously going to be an end to that competition, and U.S. workers would lose. U.S. corporations didn't lose, but U.S. workers certainly lost.
Beginning in the 1970s, the American steel industry began to falter, spurred by a number of factors. As Mel said, one major reason was growing international competition from countries with more modernized production and lower labor costs. Additionally, the demand for steel was impacted in the 1970s by a global recession, which in contrast to previous recessions was marked by both rapid inflation and rising unemployment, an economic condition we now know as stagflation. This recession reduced demand for steel, which led to a significant drop in the price of steel and declines in production. Corporations like U.S. Steel sought to minimize losses by shrinking their workforce and closing facilities that they viewed as uncompetitive or too technologically outmoded. To the chagrin of its U.S. workers, U.S. Steel also began to invest heavily in overseas ventures, buying stakes in facilities in Asia and parts of Europe, instead of reinvesting that money to modernize its existing mills. In the Pittsburgh area, the 1970s recession led to a round of layoffs at the mills, but many workers still held out hope that they would be called back to their jobs once the market improved. After all, this ebb and flow was not unprecedented. The steel industry had experienced ups and downs over the years. But this time around, there were indications that something had fundamentally shifted.
There was no question it was going down. There was just no question. It had been going down for a long time.
Mel, who worked in the trucking industry at the time, hauling steel, described the moment when he put it all together and realized that the local industry was really and truly on its last legs.
The most telling example I can tell you is that there was one day when I saw a driver from a company called Dillner in Pittsburgh. Dillner was a local company. It never ran beyond state lines as far as I know. They had a whole load of pipe, also called tube, on the truck. And I'd seen a lot of their trucks hauling this tube, these large steel pipes. And so I was talking to the driver, I don't know, truck stop or diner or something. And I said, where's this all coming from? He said, we're pulling it off barges down in Elizabeth, PA. If we're pulling it off of barges in Elizabeth, PA, it means it was coming up the Mississippi and then coming down the Ohio to Elizabeth, PA. Well, I said, well, where's that coming from in the first place? He said, it comes from an Italian steel mill. I said, what are you doing with it? He said, well, we take it up to Pittsburgh and we take it to the mill there where somebody does some minor procedure with it. So it appears that U.S. steel workers and the American steel workers had something to do with this. They kind of finish it off. But there were 100,000 tons of this coming out of an Italian steel mill. And I said, who owns the Italian steel mill? He said, well, U.S. Steel owns half of it. I said, it's over. If it's cheaper to make steel in Italy, ship it across the ocean, up the Mississippi, down the Ohio, to get it on a truck, to take it to a mill in Pittsburgh, it's over. I thought, you get the hell out of this.
Mel told me that this story took place around 1980, so I decided to do a little digging through U.S. Steel's annual shareholder reports from that era. And lo and behold, I found a reference to an Italian steel products company called Terninos Acciai Inossidabili, in which U.S. Steel had a 50% ownership stake at the time. Now, I cannot be 100% sure, but there's an extremely good chance that this company was the producer of the tube piping he saw that day. At the same time that people in industries adjacent to steelmaking began to notice shifts in business as usual, steelworkers in the Mon Valley, like Mike Stout, were living through those changes, trying their best to stay afloat in an industry where job security seemed to evaporate overnight. Mike Stout worked at the U.S. steel facility called the Homestead Works, located just outside of the city of Pittsburgh. This past year, he released a memoir titled Homestead Steel Mill: The Final 10 Years, in which he chronicles the history of the local union, Local 1397, and the ultimate closure of the Homestead Works, one of the oldest and most iconic steel mills in the region. A few months ago, Mike graciously agreed to speak with me about his experiences. One of the first things I asked him to describe was what it was like to work in the mills in the 1970s and 80s.
The steel mill was, I can't speak for it now, but back then it was very dirty, very dangerous, and very life-threatening work. And the average manufacturing worker lived 11 years longer than steel workers did. And it was not only dirty and dangerous, but you worked a different shift every single week. It was very difficult to have any kind of life when you had a schedule like that.
Mike was hired as a utility crane operator, a position which required much skill and total concentration.
These cranes were anywhere from 30 to 45 feet off the ground, and we lifted steel and loaded it, moved it around the mill to different departments, as well as emptying scrap buckets, loading steel into railroad cars, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, we were in this little cubicle cab, usually 30 to 40 feet off the ground, and they were coated with asbestos to keep the heat in the wintertime. And of course, the vast majority of cranemen I knew died of cancer before they were even 60 years old.
When not operating the crane, Mike was also called upon to do routine laborer jobs.
They would have what they called outages. And the outages is the mill would shut down for a week so we could clean out the sludge. And it was just filthy, dirty work. I almost lost a finger doing it. This was in the wintertime. I had thick gloves on. A piece of slag chipped off and fell down and cut my thumb. And I didn't even feel it. It was so cold until I saw blood dripping out of my glove. And I still have the scar. I almost lost my thumb.
And yet, even though the daily grind of the mill could be difficult, Mike deeply enjoyed his work.
I loved my job. I loved my crane job. It was like an art. And I describe it in the book, lifting steel that's 100 feet long with 4 hooks that are 200 to 250 pounds and loading it into railroad cars, into trucks. It wasn't just a job. To me, it was an art. And we loved it, and I loved it. And I fell in love with the place the day I walked in there.
One of the greatest appeals for Mike, besides the challenging work, was the community and solidarity he found within his local chapter of the United States Steelworkers Union, Local 1397, which was comprised of workers at the Homestead Mill. Unlike other locals, Mike describes Local 1397 as deeply committed to workplace democracy, not merely in terms of rhetoric, but also in practice, an exemplar of what has been called rank and file unionism. However, the union hadn't always been like that. In fact, for years, the local union leadership at Homestead had been extremely ineffective, failing to respond to workers' concerns or advocate on their behalf to the company.
We had local union leadership that had just pretty much abandoned the membership, refused to file grievances and represent them. They were basically stuffing their own pockets with union money and taking a lot of what we called lost time, meaning they took off from their jobs in the mill and they would, go golfing, and they weren't representing the members. And they had become a business union.
Fed up with the locals' ineffective and complacent leadership, a group of workers at the Homestead Mill started a movement to oust the old guard and replace them with new leadership committed to workplace democracy.
There was a group of young people that got hired in the mill in the 1970s after the cessation of the Vietnam War. A lot of Vietnam veterans, plus because of a consent decree that was won in 1974, the company was forced, half the people they hired from that point on had to be either women or people of color.
The consent decree that Mike's referencing was a landmark 1974 settlement involving the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Department of Labor, the Department of Justice, and 9 steel companies, including U.S. Steel, who were accused of engaging in racially discriminatory employment practices. The companies were ordered to pay damages to victims of discriminatory hiring and promotion, and were also required to set goals and timetables for improving the occupational status of Black, Hispanic, and female steelworkers. As a result of this consent decree, there was an effort to diversify the workforce of mills like Homestead.
So roughly in the time I was hired through March 1979, 1,000 new people were hired at Homestead. And we were all young. We were all out of the counterculture movement, the war in Vietnam. And basically, we didn't have the same attitude as older workers. We didn't take shit off anybody, and certainly not off somebody that treated us like they were a dictator. And at the same time, there was older workers in the mill, too, who had been fighting the company for 10, 20, 25 years. So it was just a matter of time before those two constituencies hooked up together.
According to Mike, a central catalyst for Local 1397's transformation from an ineffective union to a vibrant rank-and-file local was the leadership of a woman named Michelle McMills, who dreamed up a creative way to unite workers who were dispersed across the sprawling Homestead mill.
And what happened was a woman who had got hired in the mill in 1974 named Michelle McMills. She was actually 73. She was only 24 years old, hooked up with 2 members of the maintenance department, a welder named Ron Wiesen and a rigger named John Ingersoll. And they formed a rank and file caucus and started putting a newspaper out. And the newspaper became the voice for the membership. Michelle thought it up. Michelle was the mastermind. She surmised that the mill was 4 miles long. It was 300 acres. It was literally 7 or 8 mills within one mill. And she decided that the only way you could reach everybody in the mill was to put a newspaper out. Not only put a newspaper out, but allow the membership to say what they wanted, their grievances, their thoughts, their thinking, their philosophy, their art, their music, their poetry, whatever they wanted in the newspaper, and it became the voice of the rank and file. And it was the mechanism that took the movement off, which started with 3 people in 1976, and by 1978, we had taken over the union.
As Mike tells it, under the new leadership of the Rank and File Caucus, Local 1397 came alive again, and its members got to work, revitalizing and instituting committees focused on community services, legislation, women, civil rights, grievances, and education. Homestead employees gathered for community events, sports leagues, even AA meetings, and through these activities, the local brought workers together as a community, a network of people concerned about each other's well-being inside and outside the mill. These human connections would become critical just a few years later, when laid-off steelworkers created a workers' food bank and other forms of mutual aid to help one another in the wake of the collapse of the local industry. On November 27, 1979, U.S. Steel announced its plans for the complete and partial shutdown of more than a dozen plants across the country, including the Ohio McDonald Works in Youngstown, Ohio, and the 48-inch plate mill, which was part of the Homestead Works. In response, on November 30th, 1979, hundreds of steelworkers and their families converged on the U.S. Steel headquarters in downtown Pittsburgh, where they held a demonstration before entering and occupying the building. As Mike recounts in his book, a similar demonstration was repeated in Youngstown 2 months later, when laid-off steelworkers and supporters stormed the U.S. Steel headquarters there.
There was massive resistance. And so the company, when they saw the resistance in Youngstown, which people were in the streets almost every week, when U.S. Steel saw what happened in Youngstown, they decided on a different strategy in the Mon Valley. They said, we're going to shut down the mill piecemeal, and we're going to shut it down department by department and accomplish 3 or 4 things at the same time. Number one, they would shut down the department and tell the workers that it was a temporary, indefinite shutdown, lying to them and giving them false hope that the place would reopen. Secondly, at the same time they did that, they pitted worker against worker, so that the workers, senior workers who were in the department shut down, had the rights under the contract to move into a department that was still working. So it got the workers fighting each other for jobs and pitting them against each other. Thirdly, and most importantly, they skirted their contractual obligations to pay the workers severance pay and early retirement pensions.
As Mike explained to me, according to the steel contract at the time, if a person was 45 or older and had worked for at least 20 years, they became eligible for what was known as a Rule of 65 pension, which meant they would receive a check each month, similar to the size of an unemployment check, as well as full coverage health insurance until they were eligible for Social Security. The promise of these accrued benefits was a huge part of why steelworkers showed up to work day after day, year after year. But as U.S. Steel sought to reduce their presence in the Monongahela Valley, Mike says that the corporation tried to find ways to deny workers their hard-earned safety net.
They would go department by department and eliminate workers just short of their 20 years service.
But even as the workforce continued to shrink at the Homestead Works, Mike says it was still hard for many workers to believe that the mill was being permanently closed down.
I had workers tell me at Homestead that the entire steel industry could be shut down in the United States, but Homestead won't. We were a premier mill. The majority of our contracts were government contracts. We produced armor plate steel, titanium steel, all sorts of specialty steel for the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. So the Homestead steel workers thought they were special. The Mon Valley steelworkers thought they were special. They never thought in a million years they would be closed. And so when the closing happened, I would say the psychological and emotional damage was far worse than the economic damage. The only way I can describe it to you is like you're sitting there where you're sitting right now, and all of a sudden the floor and the chair underneath you disappeared. And that's how damaging it was to these steelworkers. They pulled the floor out from underneath them. The emotional and psychological damage I had to deal with, as well as the economic damage. So it was very, very difficult.
Between 1979 and 1986, the United States Steel Corporation eliminated 27,000 steelworker jobs in the Mon Valley, closing mills in Clairton and Duquesne in 1984 and the Homestead Works in 1986. But the layoffs weren't limited to steelworkers. During the same period, the region lost over 133,000 manufacturing jobs. By 1983, the regional economy had pretty much bottomed out, and within the Pittsburgh metropolitan area, adjusted unemployment rose to 17%. The job loss created a shockwave of grief and despair and upended whole communities as people and their families left to find work elsewhere.
It was like being in a war. There's no other way to describe it. And I beg any Vietnam veteran out there or World War II veteran, show me the number of brothers that you lost in your platoon, and I'll show you the number of brothers and sisters I lost in my platoon in the mill. They lost theirs through guns and bombs and bullets. I lost mine through computers and company policies that were behind the scenes and invisible, but just as deadly. I kept a track at one point between 1985 and 1990. I still have a list of 90 workers that I knew personally that lost their jobs at Homestead, who died of strokes, cancer, heart attacks, or suicide, and they were all under the age of 60. And that included, I think it was 9 suicides. So it was like, talk to any veteran in a war, and then you'll know what I was going through.
In the decades since, there have been many attempts to reflect on what happened to cause the catastrophic collapse of the steel industry, not just in Pittsburgh, but across so many towns in the Rust Belt. Scholars and pundits have analyzed various domestic and international economic trends, as well as looked at decisions that were made at the corporate, state, and federal levels. A common narrative that often emerges reads like a modern retelling of the Greek myth of Icarus and Daedalus, an epilogue about complacency and hubris. In that story, Icarus and his father Daedalus are imprisoned in the tallest tower on the island of Crete, the punishment of a vengeful king. Seeking escape, Icarus, his father, an inventor, fashions wings from wax and feathers that they lash to their arms in hopes of flying to freedom. But before they take off, Daedalus cautions his son not to fly too close to the sun, lest the heat melt the wax and disintegrate the wings. Icarus, drunk with a feeling of divine power, ultimately disregards his father's warning and soars too high, melting his wings and sealing his doom. In the modern retelling, the United States steel industry and the American steel industry more broadly are Icarus, led astray by the feeling of invincibility after decades of dominating international markets, and lulled into a false sense of security, resulting in failures to modernize facilities and keep up with technological innovations in production. And while there's certainly some truth to this narrative, a more cynical interpretation is that U.S. Steel saw the crash coming and chose to let it happen. That's where the parallels between the Greek myth and this story end, because U.S. Steel, unlike Icarus, had backup plans. Plans that may have saved the shareholders of the company from ruin, but left American steelworkers to free fall. For at the same time that U.S. Steel was instituting mass layoffs and shuttering mills across the Rust Belt, the company was making substantial investments in overseas, non-unionized mills in places like the Czech Republic, Colombia, and the Philippines. I asked Mike what his response would be to people who have said that the collapse of the local steel industry was unavoidable.
I would say that's utter total horseshit. I would say that it only happened because the powers that be that really run the show in this country, in this world, made sure that it happened and made very specific decisions to globalize the world economy and to globalize manufacturing. And what they decided to do was outsource manufacturing jobs because workers were getting paid a decent wage. We had benefits, we had pensions, and they decided to move to parts of the world where they could pay 1/100th of what we were getting paid. In China, steel workers were making like nothing compared to what we were getting paid. U.S. Steel built mills in the Czech Republic, in Colombia, in the Philippines, in all these different countries. And they did it because they could pay the workers next to nothing. They could pay them slave wages, not have to pay them any benefits, and certainly not pay them any pensions. And they didn't have unions. And if you look at the people who own U.S. Steel, who took over the ownership of U.S. Steel, they were bankers. They were financiers. They were sitting on the boards of Mellon Bank and the big banks, whether it was Chase Manhattan or Morgan Guaranty Trust. And they made a concerted decision to deindustrialize the United States and dismantle our manufacturing base and move it overseas. It did not have to happen. It happened because capitalism and the people who ran the show decided that's the way they were going to make their money, and that's the way they were going to increase their rate of profit.
Nearly 40 years later, U.S. Steel maintains a diminished presence in western Pennsylvania, employing some 3,000 workers across 3 locations: the Clairton Coke Works in Clairton, the Edgar Thomson plant in Braddock, and the Irvin Works in West Mifflin. In May 2019, the company announced a plan to invest $1.2 billion to upgrade facilities at Clairton and Edgar Thomson, and U.S. Steel's CEO, David B. Burritt, claimed that these changes would, quote, secure the future for a new generation of steelworkers, end quote. 2 years later, in April of 2021, the company walked back that promise, instead shelling out $774 million to purchase the remaining equity of an Arkansas-based steel company, Big River Steel. Understandably, this decision has sparked outrage from residents who feel as though U.S. Steel is leaving the Mon Valley behind, yet again. It also begs the question, what do corporations owe to communities in which they build their wealth? Well-paid jobs, steady employment, a clean environment? We'll delve more deeply into this question in the final episode of the series titled Air, where we'll discuss U.S. Steel's ongoing ecological legacy of toxic air and residents' fight for a healthier environment. You're listening to Extraction, the story of U.S. Steel's insatiable demand for human and natural resources and the people and places that supplied them. Support for this podcast was provided by the University of Pittsburgh's World History Center. Also, I want to say a big thank you to GASP, the group against smog and pollution, who has generously agreed to host these episodes on their web platform. Please note that the research and opinions expressed here are my own, and those of the people I interviewed, and do not necessarily reflect the official position of any organization or entity. And just one last note about this episode. It goes without saying that there is so much incredible history related to Pittsburgh and the steel industry that I wasn't able to cover in this podcast segment. However, a quick plug if you're local to Pittsburgh and interested in learning more. Rivers of Steel is a wonderful nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving the cultural legacy of the steel industry. They have a visitor center which houses an archive of historic documents, and they also operate educational guided tours of old mill sites, including the Cary Furnace, which was once part of the Homestead Works. Also, if you're interested in reading Mike Stout's book titled Homestead Steel Mill, The Final 10 Years, you can find it on bookshop.org, which is a website that financially supports local independent bookstores. All right, that's it. See you next time.